Okay, take a seat. We continue. Okay. So in the restorative sanctions, there are all these interventions stricto sensu that restore the situation in the position before the infringement. So if there's no registration, register. If there's no correct labeling, correct or label correctly, and so forth. In the punitive, we saw the naming and shaming, so that your name is put on the list as a warning to consumers. And consumers still have to decide. Secondly, the fine. A monetary amount ranging from 200 euros to $2 billion and anything in between, depending on the size of the company. We discussed that last time. And the criminal sanctions is a hotly debated punitive sanction, because it is hotly debated since the corporate law says that all the actions taken by an enterprise are resulting in liabilities of the enterprise, not of the cashier and the people running around. So that is step one of the theory of corporate law. Two, you cannot put a corporation in jail, because a corporation is a piece of paper. So you have to make the jump that in the regular criminal law it should be criminalized. So in the criminal code it should say certain economic wrongdoings are punishable by criminal sanctions like jail time as an individual. So when it is about criminal sanctions, it should be, or you have to position that as the consequence for a human being. So not the corporation itself, in most jurisdictions. So that's an important distinction. And secondly, it is sort of positioned as sort of the most extreme sanction if all the others fail. And so it's very high in the pyramid. And it follows the whole 9 yards of criminal law, including innocent until proven guilty, and the right of defense, right to remain silent. And so you get a whole package that we know from movies on criminal law. And that is why it is complicated. And thirdly, there's this sort of idea, well, maybe we regard the infringement of the rules of goods and services and market behavior especially seriously if it is done on purpose. So if it is a deliberate act of a human being to poison bottled water and put poop in it, and then you open the window of criminal law. If you cannot prove that it was a deliberate action, then it is difficult to mobilize criminal law in the realm of regulated industrial safety. Because where do you sort of draw the line? Where you already have all the other tools to make the life of the regulatory, the company, miserable. By decapitating it, taking out of business. And so criminal law is a sort of niche. I'm actually doing research on it at the moment. I invite you to do research on it. How could that interact with each other? And then especially on the thing that as a regulatory, you have to inform your authority about everything. You have to welcome them, you have to open the door, look at our drugs and goods and services. And there's a completely different attitude as in a criminal court, where you're the suspect, and the prosecutor says he did it, and then you have the fundamental right to remain silent, which is the opposite of providing information. So how do we deal in time with that? So if, as a boss of a company, you first provide for a month information to the regulator, then they find out, oh, they're bad people. And all of a sudden, you're criminally charged. And then you have the right to remain silent. But what happens with all the information you already get? And you contribute to your own prosecution, which is a fundamental right that should not happen. And so criminal law is a complicating factor but it's good news for scholars, because the next 20 years we will try to figure it out what the correct balance is, where in the pyramid of Braithwaite criminal sanctions of individuals has a role. Yes?
Within 20 years, as in, for example, the European Union or United States also?
Both. And so each market is sort of reinventing itself once in a while and rearranging all those sanction package. So we moved from a welfare state to the regulatory state, and maybe we will move to a next paradigm, a next model. And these are then the moments that we have to figure that out. And so currently, when it comes to the financial crisis, and the political emotion is, let's put those bankers behind bars, because that is where they belong. You know, so, and now they are, as we speak, implementing more criminalized norms for market behavior, including jail time for the chief executive banker. You know, those people with chauffeurs and 100,000 employees. And then how do you prove a society as a prosecutor? He belongs in jail. And that's then the big question mark in the field we are touching upon in this one. And then capacity, decapacitation, is then to make you incapable of being on the market. And then you are unable to produce market failure. Last but not least, the article of Miss Kaysen. That is a European Union piece of scholarly work. So we move from the US now to the EU. And then she basically, and this is what you have to take out, so check your own notes whether these words are in. She says, well, in the EU, this enforcement, which is another word for intervention stricto sensu, can be done in 4 different ways. We can do it as a European Union, and the biggest example is the European Commission putting fines on antitrust, so competition law infringements, Microsoft, Apple, Google, where it's the EU, the legal person EU, is sort of supranational state, imposing a fine on a market act. So that is the European Union flavor, and in her article she is still calling it the community, because prior to the Lisbon Treaty in 2011 the European Union was called the European Community and the Community Market, and now it's called the European Union. So you have to be aware of this sort of name switches in the course of time. So that's one. 2, national control. So as if the EU does not exist. National control means that if you have free movement of goods and services, then if a truck moves into the next market, so from Germany to Czech Republic, and then there's another control. And then if it is also sold in Poland, then there's another control. So national control, so national enforcement, is a sort of against the whole idea of one internal market. And that is why in quite a few markets they move to the 3rd option, being home state control. Home state control as in, well, if then the original state, or the state in which the goods and services are produced, if do they a good control, then they do that on behalf of all the 27 other member states. And then the goods and services may travel across the border. Meaning that the other member states have to trust the regulator in the home state. And if it is sort of the caricature German and Dutch and Swedish sort of control, we think, well, the German TÜV is very strong in controlling technical aspects of brakes and engines and so forth. And that is a famous enforcer of rules. But what about new member states, Cyprus, you know, or Malta with 300,000 inhabitants? How much power do they have to have enough civil servants to gather information about the question whether goods and services comply with set rules, form a legal opinion and intervene as a home state. So that is testing the internal market and the European project. And then last but not least, network control. Okay, let's make a hybrid one with a European agency gathering information about the question whether goods and services comply with set rules. The European Food and Drug Administration, checking cows and whether they have the mad cow disease, with sort of rapid response team that can check the British cows and then announce on behalf of the European Union and on behalf of the local Food and Drug Administration that British cows should not leave the island, and vice versa, and the Dutch chickens and the Belgian pigs and so forth. And we have all these examples in the newspapers in the last couple of years. So in network control, meaning, well, and that's deeply into your program, if EU is not strong enough and if a nation control is also inconvenient, let's make a network mechanism out of it. That we cut the job description of a regulator in pieces. So one team can do the gathering of information about the question whether goods and services comply with set rules. So the rapid response teams. And then the punishment can be done on a local level. So go to your local regulator and he figures out whether you get a fine and he can collect it and stuff like that. And that is the network thinking, very intriguing. Well, if you did not read it as yet, please read it. And develop some ideas on the network control and see how that fits in the other modules of this quarter and of your program. And that is then something we will discuss at the beginning of next class. See the course description for the reading. So we move now to the compliance officer. So the guy who is the employee of Mr. Wang. And I distribute the next letter of the Food and Drug Administration, where the Americans tell Mr. Wang, thank you for registration, your labels look fine, but please be aware that this is not a release for staying compliant. And then the compliance officer next week will be on the agenda as a topic of the other side of the coin, the person who, next to Mr. Wang, keep his company compliant. I thank you for your attention and see you next week. Bye bye.